Our New Testament program here at RPTS is focused primarily on what I would call the literary interpretation of the text. We are focused on asking the question, what is the text saying to its original audience, and therefore properly understood with the cultural distinctions, what is it saying to us? New Testament studies can be consumed with a variety of issues. It may be concerned with refuting higher critical attacks on the authenticity of the text. It may be concerned with the latest arcane research in New Testament interpretation. But our focus is primarily on reading the text as literature, seeing its central meaning, and being able to explain that meaning to the people to whom we will minister. As a result, there's a lot more continuity between the studies in New Testament and the studies in systematic theology and confessional theology than there might be in other settings, because we are not primarily focused on the fringe issues that tend to be the matters of debate in academia, but on the central meaning of the text. That's where the church lives and what is important to the people in the church. When a student comes to seminary, he normally has a fairly good knowledge of the Bible from his English reading. And therefore, he thinks that he has a good grasp of the interpretation of the text. And part of what we do at the seminary is by exposing him to the original language of the text, having him learn the language and begin to work with the interpretation of the language, is he discovers a richness and fullness to the meaning of the text he had never seen before. Sometimes a passage that he was sure he knew turns out to be very different in its force as he studies the original language text. Sometimes a text that was very difficult and awkward in English turns into beautiful and marvelous as he's able to access the original language text. Part of it is not just knowing the language, but knowing it well enough that you begin to appreciate its literary devices, to experience Greek not simply as a technical translation issue, but as living human literature. That is to say, to begin to appreciate the literature the way an ancient reader could appreciate the literature. In the initial study of Greek, you're consumed with the form of the words and learning the paradigms and being able to technically parse words. But we hope that the students will progress beyond that to where they will begin to experience the force of the text in its original language, the literary fullness of the text, the literary devices used, the plays on words, the allusions to other passages that are so much more intense when you're working with the original language than they are when you're working with the translation. Part of that has to do with differences between Greek and English grammar. Part of that has to do with the nuance of what words mean and how those nuances don't necessarily carry through in the translation process. Part of that has to do with allusions, where a particular word or phrase used in the New Testament picks up, calls to mind a passage or a string of passages in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, so that the reader has a sense of connection. My example for this is the word church. Ask an English-speaking Christian, where is the word church in his Old Testament? And he looks at you like, well, it's not there. We all know that. For the English reader, the word church has no Old Testament associations. It may have conceptual connections, but verbally it does not occur. But once you've learned to read the New Testament in Greek, and then you've at least had some experience with the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, you discover that the word church is used in very significant passages in the Old Testament. The Greek word church, ekklesia, occurs repeatedly in the book of Deuteronomy in the expression the assembly of Yahweh or the assembly of Israel. And so when you read Matthew's gospel in Greek and Jesus says, I have come to build my ekklesia, your mind races back to the story of the Exodus and Deuteronomy, where God assembles his people, his ekklesia, in the wilderness. And you think, wow, Jesus does the same thing. He goes out in the wilderness and feeds the 4,000 and 5,000. That is a replay of what took place in the Exodus story. It's a new Exodus, a new founding of the people of God in their final new covenant form. That level of literary richness is lost on the English reader, but is obvious in the original language context. Part of our goal in New Testament studies is to give the students the skill to do lexical studies in which they can discover not simply what English word translates what Greek word, but how that Greek word functions distinctively in Greek literature, to get its nuance of meaning, to have a feel for it, to feel its connotation. Often texts which in English are rather flat feeling have a richness in the original language text because the reader of Greek is experiencing a word or a phrase that he knows in other passages, and he knows its connotation, and all of that is brought into the passage that he is reading. The classic example of this is when the heavenly host appear to the shepherds in Luke's gospel. And in English, the word host is, first of all, it's an odd word. We don't use it much. When we do use it, it's rather flat in meaning. But the term that's used in the Greek text there means armies. It's used of literal, ordinary armies. And what the shepherds see are not cute winged cherubim with smiley faces, but a heavenly army, which could easily defeat the earthly powers. And yet they're crying out, "Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth." And part of the power of the word peace is that those who are announcing peace are more than capable of achieving peace simply by utter annihilation. And so that changes the nuance of the passage in the original language text from what it feels like in English. In other words, the New Testament is Greek literature. It has all the characteristics and functions of any literature in any language, but something always gets lost or added in the translation process. Not that the translation is wrong in terms of major ideas, but it is never exact, entirely the same as the text is as literature in the Greek context. And so we're very concerned to have our students experience the literature of the New Testament, not just to learn the technical aspects of Greek, but also to learn the literature aspects of these Greek texts so that they can communicate some of that richness by explanation in their preaching and in their teaching.